The great stone stove in the middle of the room had not been fed since dusk, and it was near midnight now, and the single room of the cabin was as warm as a kitchen in June. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the door log stood at 42 below zero and had not lifted in 9 days. It was the third week of January. In the winter the settlers of the Cutbank Valley would name for the rest of their lives. The winter of 1896, and the killing cold had come down out of the north without a breath of wind, silent and total, freezing the Cutbank to its gravel bed and stopping the smoke dead in the chimneys up and down the valley. In every thin-walled cabin along the creek, the sheet-iron stoves roared cherry red and could not keep the frost from walking in under the doors. Men fed them cordwood by the armload through the black hours and still woke to ice in the water pail an arm's length from the fire. But in Juho Rautio's cabin, one small fire lit at supper time and long since burned to gray ash had left the whole squat mountain of stone and brick at the room's center warm to the hand. And it would stay warm till morning, and it had kept the two of them warm all winter long on a fraction of the wood the valley was burning. When Amos Deering came pounding at the door near midnight, half frozen in the saddle with his own great woodpile spent to the last stick, he crossed the threshold, felt the gentle even heat rolling off that mass of stone, and could not for a moment say the thing he had ridden through 40 below to ask. Every man in the Cutbank had called that stove a mad waste of stone. To understand how one small fire and a stove of stone kept a cabin warm while the whole valley burned through its winterwood and froze, you have to go back a dozen years and better, to the day a Broadfin walked into the Cutbank Valley with an ox and a hand sled, and looked at the coming winters with a wholly different set of eyes than the men already settled there. Juho Rautio had come over from a hard northern country in the old world, where the winters ran longer and blacker than anything the Cutbank Valley knew, and where the people had built their houses around great stoves of stone and brick for longer than anyone could rightly say. He was, by the time this story finds him in his middle 40s, a heavy, deliberate man with a soot-stained beard, deep-set gray eyes, and broad, blunt hands roughened by mortar and stone. He had taken up a poor claim at the cold north end of the valley, low-shadowed ground the earlier settlers had passed over for its late sun and its early frost, and he had come there with his wife Ino, a spare, calm woman with pale braided hair and a level gray gaze that gave nothing away. For a dozen winters the Rautios had kept to themselves and to their small holding, with a small name in the district and no wish for a larger one, and every autumn Juho watched his neighbors do a thing that troubled him more each year. He watched them build their fires to throw the heat straight up the pipe and out into the empty sky. In the country Juho came from, a stove was not a thin iron box a man set in the corner and fed all the day. It was a great mass of stone and brick and clay, near the size of a small room, the heart and half the foundation of the house, and the house was built about it and not the other way around. Such a stove was fired but once or twice in a day, hard and quick, and then shut up tight. And the mountain of masonry drank the heat of that short fire and gave it back slow and gentle through all the long hours after, so that a household woke warm to a dead-cold firebox and a stove still hot to the hand. Juho had slept out the winters of his boyhood on the warm shelf of such a stove and had never once thought to ask what made it hold its heat so. The Cutbank Valley taught him to ask. For here the way was the opposite in every particular, and it was burning good men out of house and home every hard winter, and no one seemed to see it. Every settler in the valley built the same way. He threw up a cabin of green logs, thin-walled and racked together in a single season, and into one corner of it he set a stove of sheet iron or thin cast. A light, quick thing that glowed within minutes of lighting, and went stone cold within minutes of dying. Such a stove threw a fierce, close heat while it burned, and the men were proud of how fast it could warm a room, but the most of that heat, and near all the heat of the smoke, flew straight up the stovepipe and out through the roof, and the moment the fire sank the cold, came back into the cabin like water into a dug hole. So a man in the Cutbank Valley fed his stove all the day and half the night, and cut and split and hauled from first snow to thaw, and measured his standing in the district by the size of the woodpile stacked against his cabin wall. The largest woodpile of all belonged to Amos Deering, the foremost man on that stretch of the creek. A florid, heavy-shouldered man with a close-clipped, sandy beard, a store-bought coat, and a booming voice that filled a room before he did. Deering ran the best-stocked place in the valley. His woodpile stood higher than his stable roof, and he liked to say that any man who could not keep a cabin warm through a northern winter had simply not cut enough wood, and had no business bringing a wife to that country. But Juho, splitting his own wood one gray November and watching the heat shimmer off his neighbor's roaring stovepipe across the flat, stood a long while over the plain arithmetic of it. He knew, from 30 winters of it in the old country and a dozen more in this one, that the fire itself was not the warmth. The fire was only the striking of the match. The warmth was what a man could catch and hold. A metal stove caught almost nothing. It flung the heat of the wood up the pipe as fast as the wood could make it, and asked for more and more all winter long. But the great stone stoves of his childhood had caught it all. They ran the smoke a long and crooked road through the body of the stone, up and over and down and back, through channel after winding channel, and by the time that smoke found the chimney at last, it was gone near cold, robbed of its heat by every foot of brick it had crawled along, and all that stolen warmth lay soaked deep into a mass of stone that would give it back for a day. He had known that warmth the whole of his life, and never thought to ask where it went or how it stayed. Now splitting wood in the biting cold with his neighbor's chimney, roaring its heat uselessly at the sky, he asked, and the answer was so plain that he laughed out loud in the empty yard. The valley was not short of fire. The valley was throwing its fire away. From that November on, Juho Rautio turned the thing over in his mind through a whole winter, and by spring he had resolved to build. Out here at the cold end of the Cutbank Valley, the kind of stove his people had raised for 1,000 years, a contraflow oven of stone and brick, a great heat bank the size of a hay-wagon, with a small firebox and a long winding road of channels for the smoke, that a man might fire once with a small hot blaze and warm a cabin from for a day and a night. And he made, that spring, the decision the whole valley would remember and mock for 3 years running. He would build the great stone stove first, before the cabin, before a single wall, and raise his house about it after, the way it had always been done in the old country. For a mass of stone that size wanted a footing of its own down below the frost line. And it made no sense to Juho to frame a house and then wrestle a mountain of rock in through the door of it. He would set the heart of the house down first, and fit the house to the heart. So in the spring and summer of 1893, on a bare rise at the cold north end of the valley, with no cabin anywhere near it, Juho Rautio began to build a stove. He dug down below the frost and laid a broad footing of flat fieldstone. He hauled rock off the ridges by the ox sled, load on patient load, and where he could not get good stone he made brick, digging clay from the creek bank, molding it, and burning it hard in a rough kiln of his own. All that summer, where the other men could see it plainly from the county road. There rose in the middle of an empty field a squat and growing mountain of stone and brick, shaped like nothing any of them had a name for. No cabin around it, no walls, no roof. Just a great blunt mass of masonry standing alone on the rise, with a man forever crawling over it, laying course upon course. Inside it, where no passerby could see, Juho was building the thing that mattered, the small firebox low at the front, and above and behind it the long, crooked passages that were the whole secret of the design, flues that carried the smoke up steep to the very crown of the stove and then turned it and drove it down again, down through channels to either side and under and around. A long, hot road through the heart of the mass, so that the smoke gave up the last of its warmth to the stone before ever it was let go up the chimney. He plastered the whole of it smooth with pale clay and left a warm, broad shelf along one side where a body might sit or lie of an evening, and he was the better part of 2 summers at it, for a man cannot hurry a thing that must stand a lifetime. The Cutbank Valley named it before ever the walls went up around it. Rautio's Folly, the kinder ones called it. The rock pile, said the rest, and the fool's cairn. Amos Deering rode out to the rise one July afternoon, drew up his horse at the edge of the field, and laughed his big laugh before Juho had straightened up from his mortar. "You have built the chimney and clean forgot the house, Rautio," he called across the field. "You have hauled half a mountain up here to warm a cabin that isn't there, and when the snow flies you and your wife will freeze inside a monument." He was not all unkindness, Deering. In the same breath, he offered to sell Juho a good sheet iron stove at a fair price and say no more about the Folly. The whole valley stood with him. The storekeeper down at Inder's kept a joke behind his counter about the Finn who had built his stove a house instead of the other way around. The men allowed that no fire small enough to light in that little firebox would ever heat a mass of rock that size, that Juho would feed it and never get more than a cold sweat of warmth off all that stone, and that the smoke, driven up and over and down through all those foolish crooks, would never draw at all, but only back up and choke the house he had not even built yet. Only Anya said nothing against it. She had grown warm the whole of her life on such a stove as he was building. She knew what it would do, and to spare. Calm woman, with pale braided hair and a level gray gaze that gave nothing away, is not easily moved by what the storekeeper finds funny. The years of the mockery were cold in more than the weather. Word of the rock pile traveled the way such things travel in a thin settled country, from the store to the church to the branding pens, and it stuck to the Rautios like pitch. At the spring gatherings the other men left a wide berth around Juho and made their jokes just loud enough, and one heavy loud homesteader took to calling him the Stone Mason King to his face and laughing at his own wit. Juho took it the way he took the weather, without much comment, doing his share of the work, and saying his few words to the men who would still trade words with him. But Eno felt it sharper, in the pews and across the store counter, in the small turnings away that women manage without a syllable spoken, and there were nights she asked him quietly whether it was worth the whole valley's back turned to them. Juho would only say that a turned back was a cheap price, and that the winters would have the last word, and lay a little fire and go up to bed. He believed it, she chose to. When the great stove at last stood finished, a broad, warm mountain of plastered stone near as tall as a man could reach, its firebox at the front, its shelf along the side, its long secret channels wound through the dark of it, Juho raised his cabin close around it, so that the mass of it stood square in the middle of the one room, and the warm face of it looked into every corner. He set the firebox to open into the room and the chimney to climb out through the ridge, and he chinked his walls tight and low, with few windows and small, and hung a heavy door to the south. And then the first winter came, and for a while it seemed the whole valley had been right after all. For Juho, that first winter, did the very thing every metal stove man in the valley did. Because it was the only way he had yet fired a stove in this new country, he kept a fire going in it. He lit it in the morning and fed it small all through the day. A low, steady smolder, the way a man feeds a sheet iron box to hold an even heat. And the great stone stove, fired that way, seemed to fail him. It never came properly warm. The mass of it stayed cool and grudging, barely more than the blood heat of a living thing. The low fire smoked and sulked in the firebox, and worse, the long channels began to fur and clog with soot and black tar, so that the draw grew weaker week on week, and the smoke came seeping back into the room. Word of it got down to Ender's store the way such word does. Amos Deering heard it and laughed and said he had allowed the Folly until Christmas and been a full month too kind. The rock pile smoked and would not warm. The valley reckoned the matter closed. But Juho Rautio was his father's own hand at a stove, and one bitter morning, kneeling at the cold, sulking firebox with the soot black on his arms, the thing his hands had known all along came back up into his head, and he saw plainly what he had done wrong. He had been firing it like a metal stove, slow and low, and all the day long, and that was the one way the great stone stove was never meant to be fired. It did not want a small, steady flame kept alive for hours. It wanted the very opposite of that, one fire, laid small, but built dry and quick and roaring hot, burned hard and clean and fast for an hour or two until it had thrown all its heat into the stone, and then shut up tight, damper and door, and let clean out to die, while the mass it had charged gave the warmth back slow for the whole day after. The low smolder he had nursed all winter was the very thing fouling his channels and starving his stone. A fast, hot fire would scour those flues clean and drive its heat deep into the mass where he wanted it. He had been feeding the fire when the whole art of the thing was to feed the stone. He had spent a winter tending the wrong thing entirely, chasing the flame, when the flame had never once been the point. The point was the mountain of warm stone the flame left behind. So Juho swept his channels clean of the winter's black tar, and from that day he fired the great stove as it had been meant to be fired since his people first raised such a thing in the old country. Once in the day, in the cold dark of the morning, he laid a small, tight fire of dry split wood and lit it and let it roar, a fierce, bright blaze, all flame and no smolder, that burned itself out clean inside a couple of hours. While it burned, the heat of it went pouring up and over and down through the long stone road of the channels, and every foot of brick it passed drank a little more of it, so that the smoke crept out at the chimney at last near cool, while the mass of the stove grew warm all the way through. Then he shut the firebox tight and closed the damper and let the fire die to nothing, and the stove, charged full, gave that day's warmth back slow, and even, hour upon hour, radiating a gentle, steady heat off every square foot of its plastered stone from the morning clear round to the next, long after the last ember had gone gray. He learned the whole of it that winter, how small a fire it truly took, how quick, how the stone once charged would hold near 24 hours, how the cabin never swung from roasting to freezing as the metal stove men's did, but held one mild even warmth all the day and all the night. He burned, doing it so, a fraction of the wood his neighbors burned, and he never once had to wake to feed it. The winter that followed was a soft one, and it did the Folly no good at all in the eyes of the valley. The stove held the cabin warm, and even straight through it on next to no wood, kept the place like spring, while the metal stove cabin swung hot and cold. But the cold that year never showed its teeth, never once fell past 20 below. And a soft winter proves nothing to hard men. Any fire holds in an easy winter, said Amos Deering, and he was near enough right, and the great stone stove stood yet another year under its cloud, warm and quiet and mocked, waiting on a winter hard enough to settle the thing for good and all. That winter came, and it came as the killing kind. The autumn of 1896 ran dry and then hardened early. The Cutbank froze a full month before its time, and the old settlers who read the geese in the winter coats of the horses went quiet and cut extra wood. The first blizzard struck the week before Christmas and did not so much pass over as move in to stay. And then, in the third week of January, the great cold came down, that still, silent, windless, killing cold that is worse than any storm when the sky goes hard and white and the glass falls past 30 below, past 40, and simply sits there. It sat 9 days and then more, 42 below at Juho Rautio's door, and it did not lift. It was a cold that split the standing trees with a crack like a gunshot in the night, that froze the axe head fast to the block, that could kill a strong man caught out between his stable and his door. The thin-walled cabins of the Cutbank Valley failed one after another in that cold, and they failed for the very thing their owners had been proud of. Their quick hot metal stoves could throw a fierce heat, but they could hold nothing at all. The warmth flew up the pipe as fast as a man could make it, and the green thin walls leaked it out as fast again, and against 40 below, no sheet iron box ever forged could keep the pace. The men fed them and fed them. They burned through in a week the wood they had cut for a month, and then they burned their fence rails and their spare furniture and the very boards off their stable stalls, and still the frost came in under the doors and stood the water pails to solid ice a foot from the fire. And the moment a worn-out man let his fire sink and slept, the cold took the cabin entire. Amos Deering, who had cut the biggest woodpile in the valley and been so proud of it, fed his fine sheet iron stove day and night, and watched that great pile of wood go down like a snowbank in a chinook, and when it was gone the cold walked into his fine cabin as though there had never been a fire in it at all. Up and down the creek it was the same. Men who had measured their whole worth by their wood piles stood at last in cold cabins with nothing left to burn. 40 below coming in through every chink, their households wrapped in every quilt they owned and shivering. Juho Rautio did what he could in those 11 days, which was not a great deal, for the cold beat any man who stood out too long in it. He broke a way through the drifts to the nearest homesteads with what he could carry, and twice he brought half-frozen neighbors back across the flat to thaw at the great warm stove, and everywhere he went behind the cabin doors he found the same thing. The roaring, useless stoves, the woodpiles gone to nothing, the good hearty settlers that the good hearty wisdom had brought to the edge of freezing. He found men he had known a dozen winters standing gray and dazed in their own cold houses. Men who had laughed at him in the autumn, and not one of them said a word about the Folly now, and neither did he. There was no satisfaction in it that he could find. A cold house was a cold house, whosever it was, and the sight of a whole valley of good people burning the furniture out from under themselves to stay alive was not a thing a decent man could take any pleasure from, whatever had been said of him at the store. He carried what wood he could spare and thawed what neighbors he could reach, and went home each dusk to the one warm cabin, and said little. Every cabin in the valley but one. At the cold north end, in the squat log house built close around its great stone heart, Juho Rautio lit one small fire in the black cold of each morning. A fierce, bright blaze that roared itself out inside 2 hours and was gray ash by breakfast, and that one small fire kept the two of them warm the whole day and the whole night through. The mountain of stone drank the morning's blaze and gave it back all the long day after, a gentle, even warmth off every foot of it, so that the cabin held mild and steady while the world beyond the wall stood at 42 below. Eno kept her bread rising on the warm shelf. The frost never once crossed the sill. Juho burned in a week of that killing cold barely more wood than a metal stove man burned in a single hard night, and he slept the whole night through without ever rising to feed anything, and woke to a stove still warm to the hand and a cabin still soft with heat. The one thing the whole valley had sworn could never work was the one thing left in the Cutbank that had not failed. It was on the 9th night of the great cold that Amos Deering came pounding at Juho Rautio's door near midnight, half frozen in the saddle, his own great woodpile spent to the last stick, and his fine cabin gone as cold as the open field. He had burned everything a man could burn, and shed the most of his pride somewhere out on that frozen road, and he stood now on the threshold of the Folly he had laughed at for 3 years, running with the frost gone white in his beard and no words at all in his mouth. Warm air rolled out around him into the killing night. Inside, in the low lamplight, the great stone stove stood warm and quiet at the center of the room, with its fire long dead, giving off its gentle, even heat into every corner, and the warmth of it wrapped around the frozen man like a spring he had forgotten was in the world. Juho said not one word about the Folly. He said nothing at all. He drew Amos Deering in out of the cold, and set him down on the warm shelf of the great stone stove, and let the heat come back into his hands, and Eno warmed what there was to warm. And the three of them sat a long while in the mild light, and said none of the things that did not need saying. When the great cold broke at last, and the valley came out to take stock of what it had cost. The reckoning was a thing men would speak of in low voices for a generation. Wood gone, every last stick of it, up and down the creek. Fences burned, furniture burned, stock lost in cold stables, cabins abandoned in the worst of it, as households doubled up with whoever still had a wall to burn. Some had come very near to dying of it, and a few in the country beyond had. And through all of it, at the cold north end of the valley, the one small firebox in the great stone stove had never once been fed more than a single morning fire, and the Rautio cabin had never once dropped below the mild, even warmth of a room in spring. The Folly had carried its household through the hardest winter in the valley's memory on an armload of wood a day, and never sent its owner out into the killing cold to cut more, No one called it the rock pile after that winter. The name simply fell out of use. And then, when the thaw finally came, the hard men of the Cutbank Valley came one by one up the rise to the cold north end, awkward and turning their hats in their hands, to stand in Juho Rautio's cabin and feel the gentle warmth pour off that great mass of stone hours after its little fire had died, and to ask him how a man went about the building of such a thing. Juho told them plainly, for he had never been a man to keep a good thing to himself. He told them to build in stone, and build it heavy, and build it first. He told them to wind the smoke a long, crooked road through the mass and rob it of its heat before ever it reached the sky. And he told them the thing that had cost him a whole winter to learn, that the stove was not to be fed like a metal box, but fired once and hard and quick, and then shut up tight, so that the stone and not the flame did the warming. Some of them believed him now, having seen it with their own eyes and felt it come up through the soles of their boots. By the next winter there were 3 great stone stoves along that stretch of the Cutbank, and by the winter after a dozen. And the men who built them wondered aloud to one another how their fathers had ever borne to send all that good heat straight up the pipe and out into the falling snow. Amos Deering built his the very next summer, hauled the stone himself, and swallowed whatever it cost his pride to do it, and set his cabin close around it, and never again in his life did he brag on the size of a woodpile. He and Juho grew, if not close, then easy with one another, in the way of 2 men who have sat out together a cold that could have killed the both of them. Years on, a newcomer to the valley asked Deering about the great stone stoves the district had grown known for, and wherever the notion had first come from, and Deering tipped his sandy head up the rise toward the Rautio place and said only that there had been a man up there who knew how to keep a fire, when the rest of them had known only how to burn one, and that it had cost the whole valley a winter of empty wood piles to learn the difference. The great stone stoves spread past the Cutbank Valley in the years that came after, the way a good idea will once a killing winter has vouched for it. Settlers from 2 valleys over rode in to see the Folly on the rise, and rode home to build heavy and build in stone. Here and there a farm paper printed a plain account of the Finn stove that warmed a whole house all day on a single morning fire. None of it made Juho Rautio rich, for he never thought to charge a man for the truth, and none of it made him proud in any way a stranger could have marked. He was the same heavy, deliberate man at 60 that he had been at 45, laying his one small fire in the cold dark of the morning, sitting the evenings on the warm shelf of the stove he had built before he built his house. The only difference was that the county road no longer slowed to laugh as it went by, and that the great stone stove, which had once been the joke of the valley, had become, in the district's slow mind, the mark of the one man who had understood the cold. Juho Rautio warmed his house on one small fire a day for the rest of his days, and never burned in a whole winter what his neighbors burned in a month, and never once said a word to remind the valley how it had laughed. He kept a saying from the old country that he would give to the men who came up the rise to learn the building of the stove, and it was the nearest he ever came to gloating. "Any fool can light a fire," he would tell them. "The wise man builds the stone that remembers it." He had spent his whole life learning to lay one small fire and make it last a day and a night, and the cold, which keeps no man's secret and forgives no man's pride, had taught the whole Cutbank Valley at last to lay one too.